Here's a number that should genuinely unsettle you. 70%. That's the share of aluminum America imports from a single country. And before you guess China or Russia, stop. It's Canada. 70% of every ton of foreign aluminum that flows into the United States, the aluminum that goes into fighter jets, warships, tanks, and the best-selling truck Americans have bought for over 4 decades straight. Nearly 3/4 of it comes from across the northern border. Now add this. The United States of America, the nation with the most powerful military apparatus in human history, currently has exactly one active smelter on its own soil capable of producing aluminum at the grade the military actually needs. One facility, a single plant standing between American weapons manufacturing and complete foreign dependence. Everything else, every plane wing, every armored hull, every beer can and building beam, gets its raw material from somewhere else. And that somewhere else, for 100 years running, has been Canada. So when Donald Trump, in the summer of 2025, decided to slap a 50% tariff on Canadian aluminum, he believed he was applying pressure. He believed he was sending a message. He believed, as he often does, that the leverage was his to wield. What actually happened next was something a lot of economists and industry insiders tried to warn about, and nobody in the White House seemed to want to hear. The costs didn't land on Canada. They landed on American companies, American workers, and American consumers, and the damage showed up in the quarterly earnings of the most American brand, building the most American vehicle you can buy. I want to walk you through exactly how this happened and why it was almost structurally inevitable from the start. Because this isn't really a story about trade policy. It's a story about physics, about electricity, about geography, about a 100-year-old industrial arrangement that America forgot it depended on, until the day it tried to punish it. Let's start with a fact about aluminum that most people never think about, but once you understand it, the whole picture snaps into focus. Aluminum doesn't come out of the ground as metal. It comes out locked inside a mineral called bauxite, and to pull the actual aluminum free, you have to run staggering quantities of electricity through it. We're talking about roughly 17,000 kilowatt hours to produce a single ton of aluminum. To put that in terms you can feel, that's approximately what an average American household consumes in a year and a half for 1 ton. And the global economy runs on tens of millions of tons every year. This is why people inside the aluminum industry have a phrase for the metal. They call it congealed electricity, solid electricity. Because when you hold a piece of aluminum in your hand, what you're really holding is all the power it took to make it, crystallized into physical form. And here's the brutal consequence of that fact. If your electricity is expensive, you cannot compete in aluminum. Full stop. The numbers simply don't work. Roughly 40 cents of every dollar spent making aluminum goes to power. So if your power costs are high, your aluminum costs are high, and your customers go somewhere cheaper. This is the story of what happened to American aluminum. It didn't collapse because of bad management or lazy workers. It collapsed because American electricity got too expensive. Smelters in Washington, in Kentucky, in the Midwest closed their doors one by one over several decades because the economics no longer made sense. Today, the United States runs its remaining smelters at barely over half their rated capacity. The infrastructure still partially exists. The knowledge still exists. But the economics to run it flat out simply don't. And here's the twist that makes this feel almost cruelly ironic. America's power costs are still climbing. Over the past 5 years, electricity prices in the U.S. rose by roughly 40%. And with the explosion of artificial intelligence data centers eating up enormous amounts of power, the grid is under more pressure than it's been in decades. The idea of reversing American aluminum smelting's long decline in this power environment is not a plan. It's a wish. Now look at Quebec. Because Quebec is the answer to a question America can no longer answer for itself. Quebec is one of the great hydroelectric regions on the planet. Rivers, dams, vast, cold, fast-moving water that generates electricity at a cost so low that it changes the entire aluminum equation. Canadian smelters in Quebec run at around 95% capacity, not the anemic 50-something% of American facilities, 95, humming, full tilt, and over 90% of Canada's aluminum output, roughly 3.5 million tons annually, comes from that province alone, powered almost entirely by water. American aluminum companies figured this out a long time ago. Not recently, a century ago. They looked at Quebec's cheap hydropower and built their smelters there, next to the rivers, where it made financial sense. The arrangement that exists today isn't an accident or an oversight. It was a deliberate choice made by American industry itself, made over and over again, because it was the rational choice, and it has deep roots. During the Second World War, when the Allied powers needed aluminum to build the aircraft that would determine the outcome of the war in the sky, Canada provided 40% of all the aluminum used by the entire Allied war effort. 40%. The bombers and fighters that turned the tide of that war were built substantially from metal forged in Quebec smelters, running on Quebec rivers, built in part by American companies. That partnership isn't some abstract diplomatic talking point. It is written into the physical history of the last century's defining conflict, which makes what happened in 2025 feel, to anyone who knows this history, especially jarring. Let me bring it out of the history books and into your driveway, because this is where the tariff stops being policy and becomes personal. The Ford F-150 has been the best-selling vehicle in the United States for more than 40 consecutive years. It is, by any reasonable measure, the most American vehicle ever made. And the body of that truck, the lightweight, high-strength aluminum panels that wrap around it, is manufactured from Canadian aluminum produced in Quebec. Every F-150 rolling off Ford's assembly lines in Michigan and Kansas City is, in a real physical sense, built around Canadian metal. When the 50% tariff hit, Ford's quarterly earnings report told the story plainly. Tariffs cost the company approximately $800 million in a single quarter. A significant chunk of that was aluminum and steel levies, with Canadian aluminum being a major factor. Alcoa, an American company that operates smelters in Quebec and imports aluminum into the United States, reported around $115 million in additional tariff costs in one quarter alone. These are American corporations paying a tax to their own government for importing the only aluminum available to them at the scale they need. And the costs didn't stop at the corporate level. They moved downstream, the way costs always do. A tariff on the aluminum in an F-150 is, in practice, a tax on the F-150. A tariff on aluminum used in construction raises construction costs. A tariff on the aluminum in a beer can raises the price of the beer can. Every consumer standing at the end of that chain paid more, not because Canada raised prices, but because the American government taxed a material American industry cannot yet replace. Here is the core logic failure at the heart of this policy, and it applies to this situation the same way it has applied to others. A tariff only works as leverage if the other side needs you more than you need them. If the side absorbing the cost can walk away, they eventually will. But if they cannot, if they are genuinely dependent, the tariff just becomes a tax on your own economy. On aluminum, America is the side that cannot walk away, and the numbers make that clear. Suppose the United States seriously wanted to end its dependence on Canadian aluminum and produce everything domestically. What would that actually require? New smelters, yes. Facilities that take years to permit and build, and billions of dollars each. But the harder problem isn't the smelters, it's the electricity. Remember what aluminum is: congealed electricity. To replace the volume of aluminum currently imported from Canada, the United States would need to generate roughly the equivalent of Nevada's entire electricity output, an entire state's worth of new power generation, just for aluminum, on a grid that is already strained, at prices that are already rising, for a timeline that one smelter industry executive described plainly as not realistic. The one new domestic aluminum smelter currently in planning, a facility in Oklahoma, isn't expected to produce its first ton until 2030 at the earliest. That's 5 years away, and it's one plant. The math between one plant in 2030 and Canada's 3+ million tons of annual production doesn't close. Not even close. This pattern, and I say pattern because it genuinely is one, keeps showing up across multiple resource categories when it comes to Canada and the United States. Canada controls roughly 40% of the hydropower that feeds the American Pacific Northwest through management of the Columbia River system. Canadian uranium fuels 94 American nuclear reactors. Canadian potash feeds American farms. In each of these cases, the same instinct plays out. Trump sees money flowing north, assumes that means America holds the power, and applies pressure. And in each case, the leverage turns out to flow in the opposite direction, because leverage isn't about money. It's about who holds the physical thing the other side cannot make or grow or generate for itself. Now, to be fair, because this story does have two sides, Canada isn't entirely immune here. For a long time, Canadian aluminum producers had a vulnerability that mirrored the vulnerability in their oil and gas sectors. Almost all of it was going to one customer. When you have one customer, that customer has power over you. A 50% tariff does genuinely hurt Canadian producers. Revenue drops, margins compress, and there is real economic pain. That's not spin, that's real. But here's what happened. When the tariff hit and held, Canadian producers didn't simply absorb it indefinitely, they went looking for other buyers. Aluminary Alouette, the single largest aluminum smelter in all of North America located in Quebec, shifted its export mix dramatically. Before the tariff era, about 4% of its aluminum went to Europe. After the tariff held, that number climbed to 57%. More than half of the continent's largest smelters' output rerouted away from the United States and toward European buyers in a matter of months. That is what a supplier looks like when it decides to stop being dependent on one customer. And those relationships, once built, don't automatically dissolve when a tariff eventually gets reduced or lifted. Contracts get signed, logistics get established, trust gets built on a new axis. The metal that Europe is now receiving from Quebec was previously heading south. Getting it back means convincing producers who've been burned once to reroute again, on the promise that this time the relationship will be respected. The deeper irony is that the entire stated rationale for these tariffs was national security. The argument was that America could not afford to depend on foreign countries for strategic materials. But consider who America was, depending on versus who it pushed away. China currently produces about 60% of the world's aluminum, a figure that has grown tenfold in roughly 20 years, all of it subsidized by cheap coal-fired electricity. Canada produces around 4% of global supply using clean hydropower as America's closest geographical neighbor and longest-standing military ally. If your actual concern is reducing dependence on adversaries, the answer is not to penalize your allied neighbor. That just weakens the ally and increases China's relative position in the global aluminum market. The way you counter Chinese dominance in a strategic material is by building tighter industrial relationships with democratic allies who share your values and your security framework, not by slapping them with the same tariff language used for adversaries. Trump did the opposite, and the consequences unfolded not with dramatic confrontation, but with something quieter and potentially more lasting. Canadian aluminum started building new roads to new customers, and those roads don't close just because a press conference announces a policy change. So let's come back to where we started. One American smelter capable of making military-grade aluminum, 70% import dependence, an F-150 wrapped in Quebec metal. A quarterly earnings report that showed $800 million in tariff damage to an American company. Physics that can't be changed by executive order. What this entire episode revealed is something America had managed to forget because it had never had to think about it. For 100 years, Canadian rivers have been quietly doing the work that American electricity costs made impossible to do at home. The arrangement worked so seamlessly, so reliably, that it became invisible. Just the way the most important things in a partnership often do. The metal showed up, the trucks got built, the planes flew, and nobody in Washington had to think about where the aluminum came from until someone decided to use it as leverage and discovered it was the other way around. There is a real distinction between two ways of understanding what a nation receives from its relationships. One way is to see incoming resources as a sign of weakness, as dependence to be reduced, as a deal to be renegotiated on harder terms. The other way is to understand that the most powerful position a nation can occupy is one surrounded by reliable, capable, friendly partners who supply what geography or economics makes impossible to supply yourself. Canada spent a century turning its rivers into the aluminum that builds American cars, American military hardware, and Allied aircraft during the worst war in human history. That wasn't American weakness. That was one of the most durable and productive industrial alliances ever built, and it asked almost nothing in return except to be treated as a partner rather than a problem. Aluminum is solid electricity. America ran out of the cheap electricity to make it decades ago. Canada didn't, and no tariff changes the physics of that. No press conference moves the rivers. No executive order makes a new Nevada's worth of clean, cheap power appear on the American side of the border. The metal that builds America is still forged on Canadian rivers, and the most this policy accomplished was convincing those rivers to start sending more of what they make somewhere else. That's the whole story. Not complicated, not political, just physics, history, and a 100-year friendship that got mistaken for a leverage point.